Hi there. This is reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Chapter 22. The next morning we check out the hotel, feeling refreshed, say goodbye to the DeWeeses and head north on the open road out of Bozeman. The DeWeeses wanted us to stay, but a particular itching to move west and get on with my thoughts has taken over. I want to talk today about a person Phaedrus never heard of, but whose writings I've studied quite extensively in preparation for this Chautauqua. Unlike Phaedrus, this man was an international celebrity at 35, a living legend at 58, whom Bertrand Russell has described as, by general agreement, the most eminent scientific man of his generation. He was an astronomer, a physicist, a mathematician, and a philosopher all in one. His name was Jules-Henri Poincare. So you're going to like this guy, I think. I've been talking about him since I started the channel. In this Chapter 22, I need to give a lot of credit to Lee Glover, who really helped me in understanding not only the different geometries mentioned in this chapter, but gave me an understanding of what Pirsig was trying to say about axioms versus definitions. And as always, gave me insight into some of the history and topography of the actual route. So thanks once again, Lee. As the narrator is figuring out how to express what Phaedrus is trying to do in a way that is practical, and at this point, I guess you could say that's the quest of the narrator, is to figure out what Phaedrus is doing and apply it practically. He reflects on what a poor scholar Phaedrus was and worries that Phaedrus was in fact trying to reinvent someone else's wheel, let's just say, that his philosophical trajectory was kind of parallel with someone else's, but since he was such a poor scholar, he wouldn't know it. So the narrator spends a year reading what he describes as the history of philosophy, and I don't know which one, but I've heard from, and I advise you to look at Dr. Gregory Sadler's channel to help you with, understanding philosophical writings and concepts. Dr. Gregory Sadler said that some history of philosophies are better than others, and in fact, mentioning Bertrand Russell, he does not like Bertrand Russell's because of Russell's poor opinion of the Greeks. And I actually read a couple of chapters of that one, and he's right. That's an opinion that doesn't make much sense in the context of the whole of Western philosophy. Anyway, he reads the history of philosophy looking for a parallel to Phaedrus's philosophical work. It was a fascinating way to read the history of philosophy, however, and a thing occurred of which I don't know quite what to make. Philosophical systems that are supposed to be greatly opposed to one another seem to be saying something very close to what Phaedrus thought, with minor variations. Time after time, I thought I'd found whom he was duplicating, but each time, because of what appeared to be some slight differences, he took a greatly different direction. Hegel, for example, who I referred to earlier, rejected Hindu systems of philosophy as no philosophy at all. Phaedrus seemed to assimilate them or be assimilated by them. There was no feeling of contradiction. Okay, so let's revisit what he did actually say about Hegel and Hegel's absolute mind in Chapter 20. Phaedrus remembered Hegel had been regarded as a bridge between Western and Oriental philosophy, the Vedanta of the Hindus, the way of the Taoists. Even the Buddha had been described as an absolute monism, similar to Hegel's philosophy. Phaedrus doubted at the time, however, whether mystical ones and metaphysical monisms were intro-convertible, since mystical ones follow no rules and metaphysical monisms do. His quality was a metaphysical entity, not a mystic one. Or was it? What was the difference? So keep that in mind, and also keep in mind what he said of being assimilated by the Hindu philosophies. That is sort of implies an experiential, not an intellectual, but a more experiential concept, way of relating to the philosophy. So keep that in mind, what we just read. We're going to examine it shortly. As I've mentioned before, one of the catalysts for Phaedrus to pursue this path that he was on was the book, finding the book Meeting of East and West. And in that book, Northrop says that Eastern thought in general sees the world as an undifferentiated aesthetic continuum, that reality is not separate objects in the world. It's unified, and the differentiation is a matter of aesthetics. And let's just say that sort of means it's something like relevance realization in John Vervaeke's cognitive science approach to perception. So Western perception is a formal conception of reality that sees separate objects, and Eastern isn't in this book. So Western concepts are by postulation, and Eastern concepts are by intuition. One is thinking and one is feeling, I guess you could say. It's certainly not as simple as that, but something like that. Eventually I came to Poincare. Here again, there was little duplication, but another kind of phenomenon. Phaedrus follows a long and tortuous path into the highest abstractions, seems to come down and then stops. Poincare starts with the most basic scientific verities, works up to the same abstractions, then stops. Both trails stop right at each other's end. There is perfect continuity between them. When you live in the shadow of insanity, the appearance of another mind that thinks and talks as yours does is something close to a blessed event, like Robinson Crusoe's discovery of footprints in the sand. Again, we'll discuss in a minute what he means by this meeting of the two approaches. So from what we know about Phaedrus, to discover a kindred spirit must have so relieved whatever you could conceive as loneliness, even if it was just a spirit. To someone like Phaedrus, to be someone like Phaedrus is to be a lone wolf, and you can call that insanity, but that level of visionary genius, we can only imagine, is very isolating, and perhaps it is some form of insanity. It is so outside the realm of average, normal human understanding and interactions. So he goes into Poincare a bit. Poincare lived from 1854 to 1912 and looked a bit like a tall Toulouse-Lautrec. He lived long enough to be exposed to Einstein's theory of relativity, and being, the preeminent mathematician of the time, he was one of the few people who understood it. During Poincare's lifetime, an alarmingly deep crisis in the foundations of the exact sciences had begun. For years, scientific truth had been beyond the possibility of a doubt. The logic of science was infallible, and if the scientists were sometimes mistaken, this was assumed to be only from their mistaking its rules. The great questions had all been answered. The mission of science was now simply to refine those answers to greater and greater accuracy. It's odd. On the one hand, we continue to believe the logic of science is infallible. The logic, the way science is done. But we don't believe science itself is infallible because we live in an age where science is continually updating itself. And the time in which something will be updated becomes smaller and smaller. And we've already discussed this in this book. But you see all these debates, Dawkins and Sam Harris and whatnot. So that's a lot of people who believe that the scientific worldview is reality. And there is a structure in the logic of science that doesn't change, even with, say, the revelation of relativity and particle theories. You still have at the bottom some kind of logic. And we'll talk about that in a minute. It was hardly guessed by anyone that within a few decades there would be no more absolute space, absolute time, absolute substance, or even absolute magnitude, that classical physics, that the scientific rock of ages would become approximate, that the soberest and most respected of astronomers would be telling mankind that if it looked long enough through a telescope powerful enough, that it would see the back of its own head. But at the same time, we still think, or we still feel that, despite this, despite relativity and despite quantum physics, we still feel that the world is composed of subjects and objects, and that sometimes we can master those objects. And I think that's what I mean by there's still this logic. No matter how strange physics get, we still think we can conquer it and master it. And that's what I think is the scientific worldview, to some extent. So the crisis was as follows. There arose a geometry that proved that you can't prove Euclid's fifth postulate, which is Euclid's postulate of parallels, which states that through a given point, there's not more than one parallel line in a given straight line. In the first quarter of the 19th century, at almost the same time, a Hungarian and a Russian, Bolyai and Lobachevsky, established irrefutably that a proof of Euclid's fifth postulate is impossible. And they developed geometries that are just as functional as Euclid's. It wasn't the proof that was alarming, it was its rational byproduct that soon overshadowed it and almost everything else in the field of mathematics. Mathematics, the cornerstone of scientific certainty, was suddenly uncertain. We now had two contradictory visions of unshakable scientific truth. True for all men of all ages, regardless of their individual preferences. The ultimate effect of the non-Euclidean geometries becomes nothing more than a magician's mumbo-jumbo, in which belief is sustained purely by faith. So obviously what happened is the very foundations of science came into question, and with that is the implication of what we thought we were and how we defined ourselves as rational, intelligent beings also comes into question if you really go to the bottom of that. That wasn't the end of it. And of course, once that door is opened, one could hardly expect the number of contradictory systems of unshakable scientific truth to be limited to two. A German named Riemann appeared with another unshakable system of geometry which throws overboard not only Euclid's postulate, but also the first axiom, which states that only one straight line can pass through 2 points. Again, there is no internal contradiction, only an inconsistency with both Lobachevskian and Euclidean geometries. According to the theory of relativity, Riemann geometry best describes the world we live in. Well, it actually does, because if you see, let's just say this is our world, and you see these parallel lines, which are the meridians, and imagine an equator, imagine a latitude going through here. So these longitudes, these meridians, are going to be at 90-degree angles to the equator, which is a definition of parallel. So you see these parallel lines actually all meeting in the North and South Pole. So these parallel lines can, in fact, go through the same 2 points. And so it makes sense that Riemann geometry best describes the world we live in. This world. Especially now. At Three Forks, the road cuts into a narrow canyon of whitish tan rock, past some Lewis and Clark caves. East of Butte, we go along a hard grade across the Continental Divide and then down into a valley. Later we pass the great stack of the Anaconda smelter, turn into the town of Anaconda, and find a good restaurant with steak and coffee. So an interesting thing to know about the smelter, and this is from Lee, of course, is that the smelter was a smelter for copper that was mined in the area, and the copper was really significant in building, the modern America. Just think of all the electrical lines that ran across this country. It's critical to have copper for those. Copper is used, because of its conductivity, so that really is kind of the bones of modern America. But the result of this venture was a lot of pollution and a lot of other forms of misery, and I'll bring this up again when we discuss technological ugliness, and I think that's in the next chapter. So in the journey here, they don't. In 1968, this route by the smelter is actually kind of polluted, so they're actually taking the back roads rather than the interstate. And just one more line I'd like to point out about the journey before we move back to Poincare. Chris and the narrator take a nap on a church lawn. It's very lonely and open here, but beautiful. When you have mountains in the distance or even hills, you have space. Chris turns his face into his jacket and tries to sleep. Everything is so different now without the Sutherlands, so lonely. If you'll excuse me, I'll just talk Chautauqua now until the loneliness goes away. So the mountains create a border, and that makes you feel like you actually have space. If you're just out in the middle of nowhere, the perception is different. The border of the mountains give context to the landscape. The mountains define the space. Otherwise, you're just out there without definition. And one thing about the journey in this chapter is how alone the narrator feels. He's only with his son, not with the Sutherlands, and so you have to say only. Again, the disconnect between the two is present, or at least he's feeling the disconnect, and we think Chris is, of course, as well, and he continues to be frank about it. To solve the problem of what is mathematical truth, Poincare said, we should first ask ourselves, what is the nature of geometric axioms? Are they synthetic a priori judgments, as Kant said? That is, do they exist as a fixed part of man's consciousness independently of experience and uncreated by experience? Poincare thought not. They would then impose themselves upon us with such force that we couldn't conceive the contrary proposition or build upon a theoretical edifice. There would be no non-Euclidean geometry. So that's really interesting and important. What he's saying is that if these geometric axioms were absolute truth, unequivocal, it's kind of like you're going to die, or the universe is infinite, or, that kind of thing. And even then, well, for the time being, what people are treating them to be absolute truth. And that means that they would dictate the metaphysics, the substrate of reality, but they don't. We think of the axioms as science as the base of reality until something else comes along, which means they aren't axioms, they're something else. And these axioms are actually ghosts which we inherit, and eventually, often, they are replaced and fade away. Replaced by another ghost. Replaced by something alive that eventually dies and becomes a ghost. Poincare concluded that the axioms of geometry are conventions. Our choice among all possible conventions is guided by experimental facts, but it remains free and is limited only by the necessity of avoiding all contradiction. It's a little hard to understand, so I'm going to try to explain it as best I understand it. Thus, it is that the postulates can remain rigorously true even though the experimental laws that have determined their adoption are only approximative. The axioms of geometry, in other words, are merely disguised definitions. One geometry cannot be more true than another. It can only be more convenient. Geometry is not true. It is advantageous. So geometric axioms, which imply the unquestioned truth that we are taught, and that were thought to be so, aren't actually unconditionally true. They're definitions. They're subject to change depending on when new information emerges. So all that matters is that they operate as that they basically operate as tools, and that they avoid contradictions. They have to be useful tools. And I think we may be arriving at what defines a scientific truth, something that is useful because it's organized rationally and there are no contradictions, and it can be used to explain a lot of, most, you could even say most things. And when within the boundary of this scientific truth, it's absolutely true within this boundary, but not necessarily within the whole universe. The universe is infinite and it's unlimited. So that's the distinction. Now let's reflect back on Chapter 3 and the Ghost of Newton and his law of gravity. This helps us understand that a little bit better. So Poincare also demonstrates that this definition of what is convenient applies to all scientific concepts, including space and time. He did know about Einstein. And we saw shortly after that space and time could be measured differently. And now it's actually convenient with GPSs, for example, to use measuring space and time in terms of the theory of relativity instead of them being fixed entities. So this means we're kind of, switching over to a definition of space and time that's more convenient for the information age. So this means sometimes Euclidean geometry is best, and sometimes Riemann geometry is best, elliptical geometry. Elliptical geometry is better for the world we live in. We need a multidimensional concept of space and time. So Poincare goes on to show that other scientific concepts are also conventions. There isn't one way of measuring these entities that is more true than another. That which is generally adopted is only more convenient. Our concepts of space and time are also definitions selected on the basis of their convenience in handling facts, like we were just saying. Again, they're tools. This radical understanding of our most basic scientific concepts is not yet complete, however. The mystery of what is space and time may be made more understandable by this explanation, but now the burden of sustaining the order of the universe rests on facts. What are facts? Poincare proceeded to examine these critically. Which facts are you going to observe, he asked. There's an infinity of them. There's no more chance that an unselective observation of facts will produce science than there is that a monkey at a typewriter will produce the Lord's Prayer. If you look into all the facts, they're combinatorially explosive. The same is true of hypotheses. Which hypotheses? Poincare wrote. If a phenomenon admits of a complete mechanical explanation, it will admit of an infinity of others which will account equally well for the peculiarities disclosed by the experiment. So we've heard this before. This was Phaedrus's insight, and the burden of that insight caused him to fail out of university. And it was the catalyst for the quest of quality we now find ourselves in the middle of in this novel. But the point here is that you can't check every fact. Like Vervaeke says, they're combinatorially explosive. You have to choose. And so Poincare laid down some rules on how to choose, what kind of things you're looking for. First of all, there's a hierarchy of facts. So hierarchy is necessary to humans to understand anything. We see things in terms of value. This has been demonstrated again and again with lobsters, with the shape of a church, and with just about any human endeavor. So some facts are better than others. And interestingly, this come in science. Science claims to be value-free, but, some facts are better than others. So another thing he said is the more general a fact is, the more precious it is, the more you can apply it to more situations. That means it's more useful. And an example he gives is one fact is that there are species, and without the fact that there are species, there would be no biology. It would be just a study of individual entities in the world, and who knows what kind of science that would be. So some facts are more likely to reappear again and again, and these are the simple facts. And to choose simple facts, you choose the ones that seem simple. Where is it the simple fact? Scientists have been seeking it in two extremes, the infinitely great and the infinitely small. And I think what he's describing here, I believe, is reductionism. The simple facts are smaller than we experience day to day, or larger. So infinitely is the word here. Simple facts are sought at the very bottom and the very top. We're always trying to get to the substrate. And this is where I think I was talking about before, is no matter how odd science gets, you're still using the same desire to find the bottom of it in science. And so is that going to work? So that's what I was that's what I was alluding at earlier. And so then he talks about this a little bit, and I've been looking at Robert Sapolsky's lectures, the Stanford lectures on behavioral biology on YouTube again. And at the beginning of lecture 21 on chaos theory, he does a similar thing where he gives a brief history of science and ways that scientists arrive at facts before he blows it all away with chaos theory, of course. And in a way that parallels the difference between the old metaphysics we were talking about and the new one. Which is why, even though this is beyond my ability to describe at this point, my intuition is that dynamical systems theory is the scientific manifestation of Phaedrus's metaphysics. If dynamical systems dispenses with Newtonian causality and produces a landscape of conditions and constraints instead, doesn't that make sense that quality would be the way to flourish in the conditions and overcome the constraints? And isn't there something of, in these two words, conditions and constraints, this is just thinking out loud, isn't there something of classic and romantic in there, or these dichotomies that we've been discussing? And I'm going to mention a few more in a bit. So this is why I'm so drawn to dynamical systems theory, and I'd love some feedback on that. So back to Poincare. What inventors are looking for are interesting facts. How to choose the interesting fact, the one that begins again and again. Method is precisely this choice of facts. So we need to use method to figure out the rules. Particular rules seem at first discordant, but looking more closely, we see in general that they resemble each other. Different as to matter, they are like as to form, as to order of their parts. When we look at them with this bias, we see them enlarge and tend to embrace everything. And this it is that makes the value of certain facts that come to complete an assemblage and to show that it is the faithful image of other known assemblages. So this paragraph seems to say that what we thought were contradictory things actually have these likenesses in underlying form. And you may not be able to see this right away, but slowly, if you begin to look at these facts through this lens, then the facts take on this parallel. So think about the Peugeot brothers with their symbolic structure. And you'd be hard pressed, when the Peugeots talk about some of those stories, you'd be like, what the hell? Why is that, similar to that? And then you see that the underlying symbolic structures is in the same in these stories that are very, very different. So I think that's what he's talking about. No, Poincare concluded, a scientist does not choose at random the facts he observes. He seeks to condense much experience and much thought into a slender volume. Simple. And that's why a little book on physics contains so much past experiences and 1,000 times as many possible experiences whose result is known beforehand. Again, very much like the symbols. Then Poincare illustrated how a fact is discovered, and this took serious thought over several days. Then one evening, contrary to his custom, he drank black coffee and couldn't sleep. Ideas arose in crowds. He felt them collide until pairs interlocked, so to speak, making a stable combination. The next morning, he only had to write out the results. A wave of crystallization had taken place. All right, so you know what this parallels. I mean, that wave of crystallization where all you have to do is at your leisure go write it out. So we just read about this. Then there was a second wave, and then there was a third. So another parallel between the two visionary geniuses. It came to him with just the same characteristics of brevity, suddenness, and immediate certainty. I like that. That's the aha moment, Mathematics, he said, isn't merely a question of applying rules any more than science. It doesn't merely make the most combinations possible according to certain fixed laws. The combinations so obtained would be exceedingly numerous, useless, and cumbersome. Again, combinatory explosion, which of course is a great term. The true work of the inventor consists in choosing among these combinations so as to eliminate the useless ones, or rather to avoid the trouble of making them, and the rules that must guide the choice are extremely fine and delicate. It's almost impossible to state them precisely. They must be felt rather than formulated. The rules are felt rather than formulated. So what does this mean? This means that the best mathematical facts aren't ones arrived at by some scientific objectivity. They are facts that you intuitively know are the right ones. So there is something operating in there that feels like it's just what you like, but is actually is very precise. Poincare then hypothesized that this selection is made by what he called the subliminal self, an entity that corresponds exactly to what Phaedrus called pre-intellectual awareness. The subliminal self, Poincare said, looks at a large number of solutions to a problem, but only the interesting ones break into the domain of consciousness. Mathematical solutions are selected by the subliminal self on the basis of mathematical beauty, of harmony of numbers and forms, of geometric elegance. There's a beauty and a precision to that, even though it just feels like what you like. But of all which the profane are so ignorant as often to be tempted to smile. But it is this harmony, this beauty, that is at the center of it all. So that is one of my favorite passages in the book. This is describing how the right fact shines forth with harmony, with beauty at the center of it all, with meaning. The right facts have quality. The beauty he speaks of isn't romantic, sensual beauty. It's the classic one in which the structure and the form is harmonious and it's unifying. And I guess in the classic sense, at least, that's the definition of what is interesting. And remember the use of of aesthetic in Northrop's description of undifferentiated aesthetic continuum is that beauty, whether it's classic or romantic, that shines forth, the aesthetic, undifferentiated aesthetic thing continuum. It is the quest of this special classic beauty, the sense of harmony of the cosmos, which makes us choose the facts most fitting to contribute to this harmony. It is not the facts, but the relation of the things that results in the universal harmony that is the sole objective reality. So it's not the facts, it's the relation. This is an extremely important phrase. The facts support there's support in what came before, and the facts relate to this, and they are relational contributions. And it's that harmony that when something new and something, I guess, established, they meet, and it's that relational harmony. That's the beauty. And what of this objectivity we have so coveted? Even objectivity is convenient. It's a sort of mutual agreement of layering of shared experience, sometimes over thousands and thousands of years. What guarantees the objectivity of the world in which we live is that this world is common to us with other thinking beings. Through the communications that we have with other men, we receive from them ready-made harmonious reasonings. We know that these reasonings do not come from us, and at the same time we recognize them because they're harmony, the work of reasonable beings like ourselves. And as these reasonings appear to fit the world of our sensations, we think it may infer that these reasonable beings have seen the same thing as we. Relational there too. Thus it is we know we haven't been dreaming, because if we're dreaming, we're all having the same dream. It is this harmony, this quality, if you will, that is the sole basis for the only reality we can ever know. So that's amazing. And the quality is the sole basis for the reality we can know. So Phaedrus, like Poincare, obviously is going to have some problems with this. His colleagues are going to be going to reject that facts are pre-selected, same as Phaedrus wasn't going to be able to make it in academia if he was not able to define quality. So his colleagues have no choice, they felt, but to oppose what Poincare is saying. They felt they had to do this because if they didn't, the entire philosophical underpinning of science would collapse. Poincare didn't offer any resolutions of this quandary. He didn't go far enough into the metaphysical implications of what he was saying to arrive at the solution. What he neglected to say was at the selection of facts, before you observe them as whatever you like, only in a dualistic subject-object metaphysical system. So you need a little help. When quality enters the picture as a third metaphysical entity, the preselection of facts is no longer arbitrary. The preselection of facts is not based on subjective, capricious, whatever you like, but on quality, which is reality itself. Thus the quandary vanishes. It was as though Phaedrus had been working on a puzzle of his own and because of lack of time had left one side unfinished. So you see how the two finish each other out. The narrator describes a serrated edge at the end of each of their pursuits. Serration fit together perfectly. Because basically what's happened is Poincare has provided the experiential, the mystical, the enacted, the romantic counterpart. And when I say romantic, I mean the sense, the romantic in the sense of the experiential, to Phaedrus's metaphysical framework, the classical framework. So one is the map and the other is the journey. Poincare had been working on a puzzle of his own. His judgment that the scientist selects facts, hypotheses, and axioms on the basis of harmony also left a rough, serrated edge of the puzzle incomplete. To leave the impression in the scientific world that the source of all scientific reality is merely a subjective, capricious harmony is to solve problems of epistemology while leaving an unfinished edge at the border of metaphysics that makes the epistemology unacceptable. What brought tears of recognition to my eyes is the discovery that these unfinished edges languages match perfectly in a kind of harmony that both Phaedrus and Poincare talked about to produce a complete structure of thought capable of uniting the separate languages of science and art into one. So they're both saying you can't doggedly pursue logical and objective truth. Your logic needs to be embedded in value, in the pursuit of harmony, of quality. So let's try to articulate why this is able of uniting the separate languages, because classic scientific language is underlying form, and what Phaedrus was proposing was a metaphysics that included not two but three entities. But the actual experience of metaphysics, such as what we are dealing with here, the experience itself is mystical. So let's go back to the Hegel Hindu issue we were talking about earlier. You can see now that the reason the narrator, when going over Phaedrus's associations of the two that seem so opposed, were they were describing two variations of the same thing. Hegel was describing the metaphysics of the one mind, and the Hindu philosophy was describing the experience of the one. On either side of us, the mountains have become steep to form a long, narrow valley that winds into Missoula. The headwind has worn me down and I'm tired now. Chris taps me and points to a high hill with a large painted M on it. I nod. The morning we passed one like it as we left Bozeman, a fragment occurs to me that the freshmen in each school go up there and paint the M each year. So one M is for University of Montana in Missoula. I think that's right. And I have an article you can read about the M. It's very interesting. I'll put a link to it below. So Lee said a fascinating aspect is the letter M comes from the Greek mu, which is something that we're going to discuss later, but it has to do with the Zen Quan, a question without an answer, or better put, a question that requires expansion of thought to answer. So let's think about that. Let's think about some of the themes we're looking at. Water, Tao, M, mu, quality, undefinable, mystical, Missoula. And Missoula, by the way, means shining water. I've been thinking of some dichotomies along those lines. So think about the first set as opposed to the second set. So there's water, valley, yin, east, romantic, mystical, condition. And on the other side, air, mountain, yang, west, classic, metaphysical, constraints. So Chris keeps asking to go up to the M, but I can see from here it's a steep, rutty scrambler road. With our highway machine and heavy load, I don't want to fool with it. So the narrator, we know, is a very cautious man. All traces of the east are gone now, at least in my imagination. All the rain here comes from Pacific winds, and all rivers and streams here return to the Pacific. We should be at the ocean in 2 or 3 days. So, again, you've got the theme of water running down, the rivers and streams returning to the Pacific. I don't know how significant that is, but, we are kind of talking about the theme of the mountain and the river and the valley. So it's interesting to just observe. And I like this phrase because it's something we notice on trips like this. So he says all traces of the east are gone, and we don't really need to analyze this to know what he means. You get that feeling. Go across country and you'll see, you'll see that the character changes as you go from one side to the other. And there is a point where all traces of the east are gone, unless you're in San Francisco. The silence and the fatigue and the sinking of the sun depress me a little, but I keep it to myself. And so I know this feeling. I've felt this feeling myself, that I've called it for years the afternoon feeling. And that's this sort of melancholy that sets in when the sun begins to get warm, sink and get warmer. And so I think there's some meaning here, but I'm not going to try to interpret it. I just wanted to, relate my own experience. So for some reason, the narrators included a story about Chris, pooping his pants. And I guess it's to further demonstrate their relationship, because when it happens, the narrator is really quite good. He's matter-of-fact and non-judgmental and tells Chris what to do, and it's absolutely appropriate. Doesn't embarrass him. So I think that that is sort of maybe something that happens when you're camping. So it's interesting to, what are you going to do about it? And then the approach of the narrator towards his son. After Chris has washed his underwear and it is completely clean and wrung out, we head back to the logging road. As we climb it, I get a sudden depressed feeling. I've been walking up this logging road all my life. So that same sense of loneliness, melancholy, the afternoon feeling. But what is that road that logging road he's been walking up all his life? He doesn't remember his whole life. So what is this thing that unites the totality of his life? Climbing up the logging road. I'm not sure. Dad? What? A small bird rises from a tree in front of us. What should I be when I grow up? A bird disappears over a far ridge. I don't know what to say. Honest, I finally say. I mean, what kind of job? Any kind. Why do you get mad when I ask that? I'm not mad, I just think, I don't know, I'm just too tired to think. It doesn't matter what you do. And so this reminds me of truth. It's not whether or not truth is axiomatic, it's how convenient it is to what you're doing. It doesn't matter what job you get, it's what your relationship to your job is. Roads like this one get smaller and smaller and then quit. If you're using the wrong map, that is. If you're using the right map, they never quit. Later I notice he's not keeping up. The sun is below the horizon now, and twilight is on us. We walk separately back to the logging road, and when we reach the cycle, we climb into the sleeping bags and without a word, go to sleep. So, the separation, the melancholy, and just escaping it all by sleeping. So, I hope that made sense, and I will see you next week for chapter 23.